While we are working on Jenny's end to get the sound corrected, I'm getting messages here from our organizers asking if I can go ahead and get started. Normally, for those of you who have signed on to library presentations before, you know that Jenny always likes to start with a reading that's relevant to the topic, and I know she had one lined up for this evening. So as soon as she comes back on, I'll send it back over to her to get started with a poem that she had selected specifically for this topic. But tonight we are really excited to be here at the community library. It's where I'm broadcasting this evening to talk with Jenny about the opportunity gap in education, specifically as it pertains to literacy, how that opportunity gap has been impacted by school closures due to COVID, and what can be done about it. So this is part one of a three-part series in which we hope to not only share information and our thoughts about our roles as community organization leaders that are strongly committed to improving literacy opportunities for everyone, but also what we can do together as a community to really make change. So that means all of you in the audience. And I see lots of you have already figured out how to use the question function. So as we go, I'd encourage you to post your questions or your comments there. We do have some time saved at the end so that we can address any comments or take questions for the audience. So some of you may be wondering, what is the opportunity gap? And you know, lots of people may be more familiar with the term the achievement gap. So the achievement gap is this national and state level phenomenon that students from a variety of populations, including students who are Latino, students who are Black, Native American, students with disabilities, when you look across measures of academic achievement, both at the national level as well as the state level, there is this chronic, persistent discrepancy in the percentage of students in those groups who are able to meet grade level targets when they're compared to a reference group, which is typically middle class and white. When we talk about this as an achievement gap, the problem with that term is that it tends to really put the blame, so to speak, on the individual student, right? So, sorry, Jenny's in here.
Do you want to proceed like that, or do you want me to sit in here and we can go back and forth this way? I don't want to spend any more time working on the audio,
do you
please.
want to sit
Yeah.
in here? Yeah. Okay. Sorry to sorry to everybody for the change in plans here. Jenny is here. We're going to attempt to social distance and have a conversation. As promised, I'm going to stop where I was and turn it back to Jenny, who had selected a reading specifically for this topic this evening.
Well, so I'll just start by saying sorry for the technical difficulties, and what we are embracing this summer, which I think is actually very indicative of what we'll be talking about this evening, Evelyn and I, is a spirit of experimentation in disrupted times. So as we have been experimenting here at the community library with offering programs virtually, we have tried a variety of different formats. And so we're using Crowdcast this time, and so I apologize that we encountered some technical difficulties over in my office, but now we are going to sit masked at a distance from each other and get going from here. My name is Jenny Emery Davidson. I'm the executive director of the community library, and I am so pleased to be in conversation this evening with Evelyn Johnson of the Lee Pesky Learning Center. I feel like, Evelyn, we have a history of good partnerships because, of course, there is a great deal of alignment between what the Lee Pesky Learning Center does to create pathways to learning for every person is very much aligned with the community library's mission to promote literacy and access to learning materials for everyone. And we're in a unique time, as our stuttered start today illustrates vividly for everyone. And yet times of disruption can also be times of opportunity. I think that if we can define what is going on and then define how we can address it well. So, I can't just bypass the book recommendation that we always tend to start with. And so I want to start tonight, and I think that this will be a nice bridge into the conversation with Evelyn. Recommended poem by Nikki Giovanni, a contemporary poem. And I'm just going to read it to you all, and then you can check out more poems by Nikki Giovanni. And as we get to the final lines, I think it's going to lead us into some questions that I have for Evelyn and her expertise that can help us to assess this current moment from the educational environment, the challenges that the educational environment may face. So a poem by Nikki Giovanni. This is called A Poem for My Librarian, Mrs. Long. And then a parenthetical part to the title, You Never Know What Troubled Little Girl Needs a Book. At a time when there was not TV before 3 p.m., and on Sunday none until 5, we sat on the front porches watching the JFG sign go on and off, greeting the neighbors, discussing the political situation, congratulating the preacher on his sermon. There was always the radio, which brought us songs from WLAC in Nashville and what we would now call easy listening or smooth jazz. But when I listened late at night with my portable that I was so proud of tucked under my pillow, I heard Nat King Cole and Matt Dennis, June Christie and Ella Fitzgerald, and sometimes Sarah Vaughan sing Black Coffee, which I now drink. It was just called music. There was a bookstore uptown on Gay Street, which I visited and inhaled that wonderful odor of new books. Even today, I read hardcover as a preference to paperback only as a last resort. And up the hill on Vine Street, the main black corridor, sat our Carnegie Library. Mrs. Long, always glad to see you, the stereoscope always ready to show you faraway places to dream about. Mrs. Long asking, what are you looking for today? When I wanted Leaves of Grass or Alfred North Whitehead, she would go to the big library uptown, and I now know, hat in hand, to ask to borrow so that I might borrow. Probably they said something humiliating, since Southern whites like to humiliate Southern blacks. But she nonetheless brought the books back, and I held them to my chest, close to my heart, and happily skipped back to my grandmother's house, where I would sit on the front porch in a gray glider and dream of a world far away. I loved the world where I was safe and warm, and grandmother gave me neck kisses when I was on my way to bed. But there was a world somewhere out there, and Mrs. Long opened that wardrobe, but no lions or witches scared me. I went through knowing there would be spring. And Evelyn, it's that last stanza in this poem by Nikki Giovanni that I think provides a very apt preface to our conversation about pathways to learning. Because I think this is where each of us in our respective organizations, we really hope that each child can go. We really hope that each child has a book that opens the door in the wardrobe and they can bravely step through, and that there's a path on the other side, a path that's going to lead them to personal enrichment, to civic engagement, to greater socioeconomic stability. But maybe every child doesn't get the book that unlocks that door, or you get the book, but in fact, you need more than the book, you need tools. So I think that's the direction that we're going now, but we're recognizing the summer in my dream world, the summer is when the wardrobe opens. You open the book and it's that time where you can really delve into reading. But summer is not necessarily that. So I wondered, before we get into the opportunity gap, can you just talk about what happens during summer in this pathway to learning? What are the particular challenges that any summer presents? And then we'll get into this summer.
Sure. In a typical summer, many kids experience what's called summer learning loss or the summer slide. And that is simply the loss that occurs when schools close, typically in early June, some as early in May. And kids don't necessarily always have access to the books, to opportunities to continue their reading instruction, and maybe engage more in screen time or other activities that sure we need, but don't necessarily help improve reading. So in a normal year, many students, especially those who end the school year at lower rates of performance, can lose up to 3 to 4 months of learning simply because they don't have that built-in daily structure to help them continue to advance.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so what happens then? They start the school year. Is that something that maybe in a few weeks or a month, they kind of get into the groove of school and it's recovered? Do you see this being a cumulative thing, or something that it just takes longer to sort of warm up to the school year?
Yeah, like so many things, it really depends. It's so hard to talk in generalities, but for many kids, that reintroduction into the structure and the system of school really gives them the opportunity to catch up. So even though kids who ended the year at that lower level of performance tend to lose more, they also tend to be the students who respond the most quickly to being reintroduced into that classroom. Now that's not true for everyone. For some students, there will be that cumulative effect where they will lose enough ground, and then even though they make some rebound, they're not able to continue to maintain it. That learning gain is fragile. Mm-hmm. And then when there are disruptions in, again, that routine, that exposure to good instruction, they tend to be impacted more significantly than other students.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So it varies by student, of course, and the particular environment the student is in, the particular learning modalities that they have at hand and most readily employ. What about this summer? What makes this summer, we haven't lived through something like this before. Right. But I think you may have some points of comparison from other research that could help us understand the particular challenge of this summer on top of what you've described as the typical summer slide.
Right. So sure, this summer in some ways started in March for students, right, when schools closed. Schools made the right decision for health and safety reasons to close, and for many students, there was a significant break then during spring break as teachers and school leaders quickly scrambled to figure out how could they continue to provide online instruction or instructional support to parents so that students would continue as best as we could through the end of the school year. So there's been some really interesting projections made by the Annenberg Institute at Brown University. They've actually taken data from something like 5 million students, historical data based on summer learning loss, as well as extended closures due to either chronic or extended time missing school, either due to like chronic absenteeism or natural disasters like Hurricane Katrina, for example. And they use that data to then estimate that this fall, when students return to school in whatever form that's going to take, it's anticipated that they'll be on average at about 65% of where they would have otherwise been in a typical school year. But of course, that 65%, that's an average, right? That's not going to be felt equally across the board, just like summer learning loss in typical years isn't felt equally We know that the learning loss due to school closures in the time of a pandemic are also not going to be felt equally. So again, students who were already at that higher range of performance, who overwhelmingly tend to be white, more affluent students, are actually projected to gain, right? And if you think about it, they tend to either have maybe a parent who can be at home and tend more to facilitate online learning, or they have parents who have resources who can then supplement their learning, or reading is like any other skill. If you're really good at it, you're going to engage in it more because you like it and because it's not a chore, and so instead of learning to read, you're reading to learn, and these students will then really increase their vocabulary and comprehension. Now on the flip side, you have students who, in March were maybe at that lower end of performance, and typically students in that lower quartile are students who come from low SES backgrounds, low income backgrounds, or who are students who are Hispanic, Latino, English learners, students who are Black, Native American, students with disabilities. And they may not have the same level of support, or they need much more intensive instruction that their parents are not equipped, and nor are they expected to be equipped to be able to supplement when schools are closed. And so it's actually projected that students in that lower quartile may fall further behind. So what's going to happen is that gap is expected to significantly increase, which is going to cause a huge challenge, not just for students, but for teachers to figure out how to address that really now even more diverse range of learning in their classroom.
Evelyn, I want to, there's a lot to unpack there, and I want to back up to even that first statistic that you gave in this comment about what is the impact of this particular summer that we can anticipate to see. And so we first talked about often there can be this slide in learning during the summer, not felt equally across the board, but it's something libraries around the country have summer reading programs because we recognize this as something that can happen, and we try to fill that gap during the summer months. The Brown Annenberg Foundation study that you referenced suggests that kids are going to be 35%, an average, generalizing for all kids, 35% behind where they would otherwise be this summer when they start the school year because of the disruption in the school year. As you said, summer kind of started in March, and not that schools weren't working hard to keep kids engaged, but it was like turning on a dime to find ways to keep delivering the material, to connect with each student, to also offer just emotional support, to provide food to kids. There were a lot of issues being addressed. So I think that is the reality, that in some ways summer for some kids really started back in March. So 35% would be a very significant difference for any kid, and you're saying that's not going to be felt equally because of this opportunity gap. So can you say more about that opportunity gap, and what does that look like here? Can you speak to that specifically for Blaine County as well as nationally?
Yeah. So as we started our presentation, I was actually talking about the opportunity gap, and commented that most people probably know it more as the achievement gap. And the problem with talking about achievement gap is that if you look at the data, it's been decades of this pattern of groups of students who are systemically marginalized, who tend to not reach grade level performance benchmarks at the same rate that, again, more affluent, typically white students are able to. And so if we can reframe the conversation away from achievement gap to opportunity gap, what that allows us to do is really look at some of the challenges in the way public education is funded, for example. So, public funding for schools is based on local property taxes, and so schools that serve lower income areas tend to be less well funded than schools in more affluent areas, which impacts everything, right? It's much more challenging to recruit and to retain very highly qualified teachers. Schools then lack resources to invest in building their capacity. They lack resources to invest in the kinds of programs and evidence-based practices that have been shown to work for a number of students. And so in Blaine County, Blaine County, it mirrors really the national data. If you look at the 2018-19 school year, for example, the reading achievement is benchmarked in this state for kindergartners through third grade students through the Idaho Reading Indicator. And just in the aggregate, right, so for all students from kindergarten to third grade who are white in Blaine County, about 88% of those students met grade level targets from their respective grade level, kindergarten to third grade. If you look at the same data except for Latino students, only 44% of students K through 3 who are Latino were able to meet benchmarks. And so what that suggests is that there's a real need to take a hard look at what is happening instructionally, what's happening in terms of programming and services. Schools are taking budget cuts even now as we speak, and then being asked to take additional measures that are going to be more costly. So I certainly don't want to sound like it's all on the school to fix. But so they're experiencing that reality. And then as organizations that are involved in literacy, we also have to think about how can we not only, put in like these urgent sort of stopgap measures, but what can we do as a community in the bigger picture, in the longer range picture, to really start to think more systematically about how we change those statistics. I can't say statistics with my mask on. Yeah.
I mean, it is, those statistics are pretty, I mean, they're startling, the discrepancy, and I really appreciate, and I want to emphasize also, I know the school district here, and I think school districts around the state, like, they acknowledge this opportunity gap and are working to address it. And I think what our respective organizations, and I know many others that address literacy in the community, really see and want to advance is, it's not only the schools. I mean, it is about creating a literacy rich environment. Like, our whole ecology as a community is supportive of literacy, and for every person and all different kinds of learning abilities.
Yeah.
And this year has amplified that need for us because kids have truly not been in school. So again, just to underscore the gaps that we see here, we're talking about a 30+% difference in performance in reading between white students and Latino students. And I think there are also significant gaps in socioeconomic brackets. I think that for the English language, arts, and literacy stats that I looked at, it was about a 17% difference between students who come from low-income families versus their peers who do not. English language learners, 40%. And it's not, we're not only talking about, we're focusing on reading in this moment, but it's not only across reading, right? It's numeracy skills,
Absolutely.
It's math skills, science skills.
Across the board.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
And you and I have been talking about this now for actually quite a while, and I saw a couple people log on to the talk this evening who have been involved. And so, before this summer and before school closures, we had been really trying to figure out what are the ways that we can do something meaningful to, again, like address the situation now and then also start this broader conversation. And so one of the things that I am really excited about this summer, I love the way you framed that times like this, are challenging, but they also bring opportunity. And one of the opportunities that came to us was the ability to run a summer program, our Pathways to Literacy program. It's small, but it was something we have really aspired to do for a while now, which is to run a summer foundational reading program for students coming into first grade, because what we've learned as a center that works with students with learning challenges is that when we can get early intervention measures in place, not only do we don't need like the same level of intensity as we do when we wait until later, but they're also way more effective. And so we were able to hire a summer tutor who speaks Spanish and has some tutoring background to run an 8-week, 3-day-a-week reading program for students who are English learners here in the Valley who are entering first grade. And like I said, everything kind of came together at the last minute, but what I found so encouraging was when I saw that the stars were going to align, we had funding in place, I had staffing in place, I was like, okay, well, where are we going to operate so that we can do it safely? And then how are we going to recruit families? How are we going to let them know? And so I reached out to Christy at the Blaine County Education Foundation, who reached out to a reading specialist at Hemingway, who reached out to a teacher at Alturas Elementary. In about 3 days, we had the word out and we had all our slots filled. And then the community campus in Haley has been incredibly gracious about, working with us. We set up outside down there, and families come one at a time so that we can distance and make sure we're keeping kids and our staff safe. And then I called you and said, hey, can we set up outside of the library? And so that families who are in Ketchum don't have to drive down to Haley. And so, every day our teacher meets several students in the afternoon. It's been such a positive thing that's happened this summer, is to see that quickly so many people come together. To me, it speaks to the need, and it speaks to the desire, I think, on behalf of everyone involved to really get something started.
I agree, and it, to me, emphasizes the need, again, to approach literacy through a whole network. If you expect literacy to happen in only one place and only set times, right, then gaps are going to emerge. Gaps of opportunity, gaps of pandemics or natural disasters, yeah, and other things. So you really need that network, which really I think argues for the importance of communication between nonprofit organizations and schools to be able to step in, as you so nimbly did. And it has been wonderful to witness, to see these, yeah, tiny little kids. These are the squirts who are just starting off on their academic careers, and in many instances are English language learners, mm-hmm, and come from families where English may not be spoken a lot at home, and yet they are going to be starting first grade, having perhaps completed half of their first year of schooling in kindergarten, right, not going to the physical school. So to see those kids come and have these tutorials, and I happen to know that one of the kids today left not only having practiced his reading skills, but having determined that his lifelong dream is now to be a teacher because of his positive interaction with his Lee Pesky Learning Center tutor. So it's been great to see that happen. I'm wondering if you could also elaborate on, that program is addressing content and helping kids to learn reading skills and strategies and to practice. It's more than that, though, that kids are missing when they're not in their classroom environment. So can you talk more about, besides the content being not delivered perhaps, or not delivered in conventional ways, and the need to address that as part of the opportunity gap, there are other things that kids may be missing out on that warrant us thinking about too.
Yeah, it's absolutely right. So again, one of the things that we specialize at Pesky is really the becoming expert in the science of learning. And so we're very fortunate as an organization to not only have teachers on staff, but we have clinical psychologists and social workers, and we work together through this clinical model to really understand all of the factors that impact academic performance. And you're absolutely right, it's not just academic skills, it's what we call information processing, what other people refer to as cognitive processes, so your working memory and your attention. And those are skills that allow us to essentially orchestrate the process of learning. For students with learning challenges, oftentimes those processes can be compromised, and that's what, of course, leads to whether it's dyslexia or dyscalculia. That's a very pronounced deficit in one of those processes is what impacts learning. And as a result, our teachers on staff have to really think through how you accommodate those processes. Things like working memory and attention can also be highly impacted in a negative way by stress, by anxiety, which of course all of us are feeling an increased amount right now. So if you think about it in terms of your own background and situation, just think about a time where you were overwhelmed by circumstances or highly stressed or highly anxious. It's really hard to focus. It's hard to have the same level of attention. Your memory might not be as sharp, right? It's because you're spending so much of your resources worrying or feeling stressed. So for students who routinely experience environments that are not supportive, that are not safe, that are not, or that are maybe more precarious in terms of providing for basic needs, they live with a level of stress that over time can compromise those processes, their working memory and their attention. Providing safe spaces in schools is a way that schools really offer a solution by giving that structure and through a process that we called shared regulation, right? So teachers in classrooms create positive, safe learning environments where there are routines, there are structures, there are expectations for how we interact, whether that's during a lesson or whether that's peer-to-peer or out on the playground. And so even when students are not engaged in the exact, writing, reading, doing a math lesson, there is all of this social learning that happens in schools. And so in an online environment, it can be really hard to recreate that. Mm-hmm. And so students who really need that structure in order to become self-regulated, themselves, are really missing out on that ability. In fact, I'm going to go back to that Annenberg report. One of the other findings was that for students with disabilities or students who had experienced really negative outcomes, so like being expelled or suspended from schools, they actually in the online environment tended to not engage, not to sign on, to turn their video off, to not use chat features and those kinds of things that signal engagement. Now in a classroom, it's easier to call those, to pull those kids back in. Online, if they're at home and they get up and walk away, there's very little we can do, to pull students back. And so it is a concern.
I'm really interested in the term you're using about shared regulation and thinking about how this is a time when that is heightened for everyone. I mean, I think we see the urgency around learning that skill even more now, where as a community we're having to learn to wear masks, we're having to learn to be at a distance, and it's like if everybody's not collaborating on this, it really doesn't work.
Right.
And that's what can be illustrated, demonstrated, practiced in a school classroom.
Absolutely.
And that's as important or just differently important than the content that is being conveyed. And so we have, I think Evelyn and I are conscious of, we're not trying to have this session be a real downer, but we are trying to define the problem and the particular challenges, because if we don't see the challenges clearly, or if we fail to acknowledge that they exist, then there isn't a lot of hope that we're going to address them effectively. But if we can identify them, then I think there are opportunities here. Thinking about how the school year has been so dramatically disrupted for so many kids, but for many kids, learning and education was already disrupted, right? I mean, it may have been disrupted because of learning disabilities that they were struggling with that were not being fully addressed, home life and environments. And so perhaps the fact that the whole system is disrupted now also creates an opportunity for some reinvention that might actually serve students well. But there are challenges based on if it is online learning going forward. How do you do this, and how do you help teachers to do this who haven't been confronted with it before in promoting this shared regulation and different processes, as well as conveying the content that they're responsible to deliver?
Yeah. So many things to respond to in that. First and foremost, the primary concern is always access, right? So do students even have the technology needed to get online? And here are some really bright spots. So I know the Blaine County Ed Foundation, I know Boise schools, I know lots of schools across Idaho raised a lot of funds within their communities, and then were able to ensure that they could provide either a Chromebook or tablet or some device to every family. I know in Blaine County they also were able to then provide Wi-Fi access to make sure that all students and families would have access to log in. So that was really encouraging to see so many communities come together to ensure that kids could just log on. So now that we have, in most places, we have that issue resolved, we are working at Pesky to really think through how can we help teachers think about how you recreate those strategies, the tools that you use in the classroom. What do they look like in an online environment? So we have a team of professional development experts who are involved in what's called the Idaho Early Literacy Program, where they're working across 8 different school districts in Idaho, as well as in early childhood settings, to help teachers build their instructional skills with the main focus on literacy, but with that, the classroom management and the self-regulation strategies that are so critical, right? Because if a child can't attend to the lesson, then it doesn't matter what you teach, they're not going to get it. And so our team, just like every other organization, has been asked to pivot and to respond in a meaningful way to this time. our team was able to put together some really helpful tools and strategies for teachers that don't take away from the evidence-based reading strategies, right? We still need to do those, but have thought through how to set up as a teacher with whether that's with using slides that we share or whiteboards behind us, and then to create some tools for students to be able to respond on whiteboards, to have like response cards, to do daily check-ins with students who may be more vulnerable or more at risk, so that they know that someone on the other side of this computer is concerned about me, cares about me, and wants me to be successful. And so they're working right now to really think through how to get those trainings out to teachers. In August we'll be working like this through Zoom and video conference with teachers, and that gives us, of course, an opportunity to model a lot of those strategies for teachers so that they can turn around and put those into place in their online classrooms.
Mm-hmm. And I think that is exciting because online education, it will become more pronounced, I think, regardless of the pandemic.
Sure.
And so to have this giant shove to provide more instruction on how to do that effectively, or just to experiment with how that might be done effectively, to make a giant shove to try to address the digital divide. I mean, if we're talking about opportunity gaps, the digital divide is particularly stuck in this instance when people have been self-isolating at home, and the main way to connect has often been through the internet. And if you don't have reliable internet access, or don't have computer skills and computer literacy, then you're really going to be stuck.
Yeah.
So the fact that, as you said, a lot of school districts and communities have worked hard and very rapidly to get internet access and devices to kids at home, that there are organizations like the Lee Pesky Learning Center doing really innovative work to provide resources to teachers and coach them for this educational possibility that they may be facing in a more long-term way. But I also don't want to veer away from, even if kids are back in the classroom, it's not just a challenge if it goes to online learning or if that's a new component. To circle back to what you were really saying at the outset, even if they come back to the classroom as kids knew it before, that the disruption, the opportunity gap has been exacerbated. There's added stress that they're going to be feeling. So I want to make sure to not lose sight of, it's not just going to an online environment that poses challenges, it's just coming back to school and learning.
To give a very specific example, because I think it can help to really understand the issue. In our summer reading program, we are working one-on-one outside. Students are masked, or teachers masked. I had the wonderful opportunity to work with an older student who brings his little brother, and he asked for some support with his own reading. And they're new to the country. They've been here just over a year, and so his English is not strong. And when I ask him to read aloud with his mask on, it's hard to hear, and he's not enunciating clearly, in part because it's challenging for him to read through. And so so in some ways he's attempting to use the mask to kind of cover up what he doesn't know, which is a very understandable response. Having, I've had the opportunity to live and work abroad and have done all the same kinds of things when I haven't trusted my ability in a second language. And now you think, a student in a classroom or online, students who struggle tend to learn really effective coping skills that aren't necessarily always helping them learn more. What they're helping them do is kind of get through the classroom without, being the center of attention. And so to me, it's, this experience this summer has really highlighted how important it's going to be for teachers, again, that community focus, because there's no way teachers are going to be able to do this for everyone. Like, to think through, how do we reach out and make those additional connections for students who are particularly vulnerable, who need that additional one-on-one or that additional intervention and support, because they're going to need it now more than ever before. Yeah.
Evelyn, that is such a poignant anecdote for you to share, and especially as you talk about the student masking what he does not know. And of course, masks have this great this intense symbolism for us right now, because we're literally wearing masks. And to think about how individual students may learn to mask what they don't know in order to just navigate the school day, how we as a community can sometimes mask or overlook what we don't recognize about the disparities between different groups of students, in terms of that opportunity gap that you have described so well. And so removing that mask, as painful as it may be, also allows for some pathways forward, I think. As we get close to the end of our time here, and I'm going to be glancing at the chat board here in a minute to see if there are questions from our participants to bring forward. Again, our focus today has really been to describe the scope of the challenge and the particular challenge right now. But I'm wondering if you want to give just a few other glimmers of hope, because that we'll delve into more in the next couple of sessions, because there is the Lee Pesky Learning Center meeting with individual kids outside, helping them in a very particular way to overcome the opportunity gap this summer. At the library, we are just giving away books to kids. We have a bookmobile during the summer. This summer, instead of circulating the books, we're thinking kids need books at home, whether they're in school or not, and they need them permanently. So we're just going to give away books this summer. And as you described, we're fortunate that there's the generosity of people to step up and help make those things possible. So there are these, and the school districts getting devices and internet access where they didn't exist in homes before. So there are these positive things happening. As I glance at these questions, do you want to just give another glimmer of?
In hard times, the best thing that happens is people come together. And so, as I described earlier, so many people came together to make this possible, but we're on about week 5 of our 8-week program, and now looking towards the fall. So how can we ensure that we keep in place some supports and then turn this program into an annual, a summer intensive. Hopefully by next summer we'll be able to operate in small groups, maybe 3 students at a time. We don't want to lose that individualization, but we do want to serve more students and then maintain that support throughout their first grade year. And we've already got conversations started with lots of people on how we might make that happen. I think the best thing that will come out of this going forward is that we will start to work a lot more collaboratively on how to meaningfully address these systemic problems, because we have to, because we're all facing challenges of constrained resources. We're all looking at this disparate impact that closures and job losses and social, limited social services, constraints on social services are having, and everyone is wanting to do something about it. And so I'm feeling, I guess maybe I'll say cautiously optimistic about what's going to happen. And I just hope that we can maintain the momentum, not just for these urgent responses, but that we can use this as a jumping off point to really think through, like, what are we going to do as a community to meaningfully and comprehensively address this issue.
Right. And I think the questions that I'm seeing here, I feel like we're going to be just leaving people on the edge of their
Yeah.
seats, really have to do with, an eagerness to talk more about concrete actions. And because we have 2 more sessions ahead of us and only really a few minutes left today, I would like you to speak a little bit. I think we talked about the children themselves, the students themselves. We've been talking about teachers. But there are, and we've talked about nonprofits that can step up. But what about other people in the household? So the parents or caregivers, do you just want to maybe outline for us the significance of that role in addressing the opportunity gap, or do you see that as part of addressing the opportunity gap?
Yeah, without a doubt. There are a lot of barriers to learning for many students, right? And those aren't just whether I struggle because of a learning challenge or because I'm learning English, but if I'm in a household where my parents either have jobs that prevent them from being able to invest, or they don't have the background to be able to support learning, those can be real challenges. And so one of the things that we use at the center, and that our professional development team is so skilled at doing, is taking the research around early reading instruction and thinking through how to make very practical, easy to use tools for parents as well as for teachers. We've got lots of resources on our website for parents, that many of which are no cost. We've also hosted virtual parent events for for parents with very young children at home. We're using this summer a program called Teach Your Child to Read in 100 Easy Lessons. It is a research-based instructional guide designed for parents that any parent can purchase, from their bookstore, from an online bookstore, for about $20. But what's really exciting about what we're doing is we're having someone create a Spanish version of that guide, so that parents who themselves are English learners will then have a resource. Our goal is to give it free to residents of Wood River Valley, so that they can at home work to develop their children's literacy in Spanish. Because while we know it's not like a direct, just because I learned to read in Spanish doesn't mean I won't have any problems learning to read in English, at the same time, we know a lot from bilingual education that when children do develop literacy in their native language, the transition to a second language, to English, is often greatly facilitated. And so in that way, I feel like we'd be giving parents, really empowering them to take part in a very meaningful way in supporting their children's learning.
Evelyn, thank you. I think to summarize where we got today, and again, I am excited that I feel like people are chomping at the bit to, like, let's keep talking about what we can do. But to summarize the ground that we've covered today, so you have identified very concretely, like, there is an opportunity gap across the country. We see that Latino students, Black students, Native American students are not achieving the same results on the standard assessments as white students. Not because of ability, there is an opportunity gap that is there.
Absolutely.
We have described how during the summer months that can be exacerbated because kids may not be engaged in learning. The kids who are already performing well may actually accelerate over the summer with more time at their disposal to delve into reading. But for kids who have learning challenges, are already at the lower end of that opportunity gap, they're going to be starting just at the end of a typical summer behind where they left off and behind where many of their fellow students are. And then this year, of course, we can expect that disruption to be even greater. And this is where you cited the studies of other, natural disasters or chronic absenteeism, where the students' school year has been dramatically interrupted, and the typical summer slide becomes even more significant, such that students might be at 65% of where they would have been otherwise.
Right.
So the magnitude of the challenge is real, and one that warrants our serious and immediate consideration.
Yeah.
And what you've already started to identify is there are also real resources and tools and a lot of minds that are thinking very experimentally about this, and innovatively, and an eagerness to get those resources out. So I look forward in the next 2 sessions delving into some of those examples of what we can do even more.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm always more excited to talk about solutions than problems.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
So the next session is going to be moderated by Deanne Campbell, who is the director of the Children's and Young Adult Library here at the Community Library. And I'm eager for your dialogue too, because there are things that our library and many libraries around the country have been trying to do in this particular context of COVID-19. And then the final session will be moderated by Martha Williams, the Programs and Education Manager. So the conversation will continue. So
great. Yeah. Thank you. I look forward to it. And thanks to everybody who signed in tonight to listen and to participate. And we hope to see you on the next session as well.
Thank you. Have a good evening.